My title is Bigots in the Middle. Although I have studied Samuel Johnson's criticism of Samson Agonistes several times over the years, until now I failed to ask why, at the very end of an aesthetic argument devoted to establishing a devastating critical structural flaw, the lack of a middle, he concludes with a sentence insulting readers who approve the tragedy which ignorance has admired and bigotry applauded. Previously, I assumed that Johnson invoked bigotry in a general sense to refer to an obstinate predisposition to approve of anything by Milton. A great poet wrote Samson, it must be good. But in rereading Professor Muhammad's and Professor Fish's articles, I noticed that bigotry pops up elsewhere in critical responses to Milton and his tragedy. Ezra Pound judged Milton himself guilty of bigotry, indeed asinine bigotry, as well as beastly Hebraism. And John Kerry recently insisted on a revisionist interpretation of Samson because, in another example of circular reasoning, Milton was a, quote, subtle-minded poet, unquote, not a, quote, murderous bigot, unquote, though the example of Pound suggests that the alternatives are not exclusive. For Americans who grew up when I did, the primary meaning of bigot is racist, but this is a historically and culturally localized synonym. According to the OED, the French may have coined bigot during the 1100s from the English expression, by God, as an offensive name for the Normans. The original English meaning for bigot, with examples dating from 1500, predisposition to approve of anything by Milton. A great poet wrote Samson, it must be good. But in rereading Professor Muhammad's and Professor Fish's articles, I noticed that bigotry pops up elsewhere in critical responses to Milton and his tragedy. Ezra Pound judged Milton himself guilty of bigotry, indeed asinine bigotry, as well as beastly Hebraism. And John Kerry recently insisted on a revisionist interpretation of Samson because, in another example of circular reasoning, Milton was a, quote, subtle-minded poet, unquote, not a, quote, murderous bigot, unquote, though the example of Pound suggests that the alternatives are not exclusive. For Americans who grew up when I did, the primary meaning of bigot is racist, but this is a historically and culturally localized synonym. According to the OED, the French may have coined bigot during the 1100s from the English expression, by God, as an offensive name for the Normans. The original English meaning for bigot, with examples dating from 1598 to 1787, is religious hypocrite, and also a superstitious adherent of a religion. For 2 centuries in Britain, then, bigot was a term of abuse that could be applied either to puritanical sectarians, hypocrisy and zeal, or to papists, superstition. Jonathan Swift's Tale of a Tub, in this original polemical sense, is a satire about the bigots Peter and Jack. A later and still current sense, with examples dating from no earlier than 1661, that's significantly later, is less polemical, indicating a person who adheres to a religious practice or belief unreasonably or obstinately. Finally, in extended use, bigot refers to a fanatical, strongly partisan believer in general. Samuel Johnson, or Dictionary Johnson, working during the middle of the 18th century as a lexicographer, defines the word in its extended sense, but with an apparent glance at the stereotypical Puritan and his political fray. Quote, a zealot, one devoted to a party, unquote. Even if Johnson did think that bigots applaud Milton's drama because of an irrational prejudice in favor of anything Miltonic, such a prejudice would appear most obviously among readers sympathetic to Milton's party, and in their response to this work particularly. Such readers, as David Lowenstein has argued, were, quote, less likely to be morally repulsed by the drama's apocalyptic violence, to perceive the vengeful Samson as a valiant saint, moved by the Spirit to carry out God's militant work against idolatrous and uncircumcised enemies, unquote. On the other hand, if Milton really did approve of the violence he represented, Carey would join Pound in identifying him as a bigot and join Johnson in refusing to celebrate the tragedy as the achievement, quote, as an achievement of the human imagination. For the pious Carey, just as much as for Johnson's clapping bigots, aesthetic judgment rests ultimately on religious conviction, not on formal analysis of the work in question. Though I share Professor Fish's dismay at Professor Carey's appeal to moral urgency as the determinant of interpretation, I have come to think that Johnson, despite his apparently objective critical rationale, is as biased as Carey openly reveals himself to be. The basis of Johnson's critical disdain, the tragedy's alleged want of a middle, indicates the extraordinary impact that the beginning and the end of the play had on him and presumably on others of his time. Once we bracket out the middle, the spectacle of the utterly defeated, blinded strongman enslaved and brutalized by his religious enemies is suddenly juxtaposed with the reported spectacle of the horrifying destruction of the Philistine temple and the slaughter of thousands by and with Samson. Johnson dismisses the middle scenes as impertinent superfluities. What matters to him is just what Lowenstein suggests mattered to those Johnson accuses of bigotry: the spectacle of the utterly defeated hero and his conclusive mediation of divine vengeance. When I wrote about Samson in 1999-2000, I tried to explain the progress of the middle of Milton's drama by appealing to the logic of identity and the ethics of temperance. I accepted Johnson's claim that the tragedy has a regular Aristotelian beginning and an end. I no longer do. Johnson quotes Aristotle's definition of the beginning as, quote, that which hath nothing necessarily previous, unquote, a definition that I find difficult to square with the entrance of a recently blinded, enslaved hero speaking his own prologue of pain. And the end? Maybe it does point to King David's eventual overthrow of the Philistines. But the conflict epitomized by the dead Samson, tangled up with the bodies of those he has killed, will not end even then. The Jews and the Philistines just trade places. As a story of religious conflict, Samson Agonistes is all middle. It begins and ends in the midst of things. Citing Christopher Hill, Suzanne Woods observes that the beginning of the tragedy evokes the end of Paradise Lost, with Adam and Eve's exile from Eden and entry into the world as we know it. The end of Paradise Lost is the beginning of a middle that in Milton's view will last through various historical stages until Judgment Day. From this perspective, all history is the middle, and unless we abandon an apocalyptic belief in which true believers are finally separated from asinine bigots, it is difficult to see how, by God, we will avoid remaining stuck in a bloody middle of our own choice and election.